complexity for all my life. So when I was a kid, I used to love taking all the toys in my toy box and stacking them up. So connecting them together with ropes and pulleys, getting books to fall over like dominoes. And these are kinds of what we end up building in the web today, these machines that are built of very disparate parts that interact well together. So our toy boxes are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Each one has very recently received some very new powerful APIs that really change the way we think about the web. And my 4 favorites of these are CSS Grid, which is a CSS API for 2D layouts. Who here is using CSS Grid already? Awesome. You're like never usually that amount of hands. So like, good job. JavaScript API, web animations. Who's using these today? Okay, not a few hands. This is a really cool one. You'll really like it. Web components. More than I expected. That's really cool. Web components are super usable nowadays and fantastic. CSS Custom Properties. Oh yeah. Who'd heard of CSS Custom Properties before? Not many. Okay, these are the bee's knees, like they're the cat's pajamas. I love them. They're really cool. So I'm going to start off with CSS Grid. So I'm going to quickly introduce each of these. I'm not going to give you code examples because you're not taking notes and you won't remember. Like, it's on MDN, look it up yourself. I'm just going to like tell you what they're all about. So CSS Grid is a framework for doing 2D layouts in the web. So you don't need a framework to use CSS Grid. CSS Grid is the framework already. It's extremely powerful for that. You can knock off like 250 kilobytes of CSS by just not including a grid library like Bootstrap or something, which like in the world of performance, like that's 250K you can use for other stuff when you've got such a limited performance budgets in the web. It's really nice and declarative. It's kind of simple to use, but pretty complex. Actually, I think I had more points on my previous slide. Oh yeah, actually no, I didn't. Remembering stuff, that's a first. So it's really powerful. It's simple to get started with, but there's a lot of intricacies, so it will take a long time to master. And I think we're even nowadays still scratching the surface of some of the really powerful patterns CSS Grid will allow us to do. So this is a simple template here with 3 rows, 3 columns, spaced out in like the year 2000 like ideal but very hard to get to layout. So this is responsive design out the box, and it just works really beautifully. And I've placed a header in the grid. And the nice thing about it is because we're designing our layouts intentionally, and we're not just having stuff that fills in from the bottom, we can have intentional white space. So bits of the page we can leave empty because it gives a better user experience. It gives the eye a place to rest. It allows us to build something that feels very friendly and accessible to users. It allows us to get rid of craft, like non-declarative HTML elements we were only using to lay out our pages. So here, if I'm laying out a page with Flexbox with some widgets in it, we now no longer need these random divs which don't mean anything, because this section itself has been laid out with grid, and it knows how it wants to look. This power gives us a new way of thinking about how we lay out pages, because previously when we build websites, we'll get a design from our designer, and we'll have to somehow hack all our elements to be placed to look like the design we've been given. And so we think about, like, what can I do to this header, to this span, to this div, to make it look like this? Instead, what we can think about instead is, I have my page. How can I divide it up to look like the design my designer's given me? And then I can put items into this grid at a later date. And it really simplifies the way we work. So if this is the way you build CSS files, then CSS Grid is really going to change stuff for you. Like, it allows you to do stuff intentionally. You design it in your CSS file and stuff fits into your grid. You're not constantly being like, oh, if I increase padding here, I then push my title onto the next line, and now I need to, like, increase a margin over here. Like, no more of that. It's proper layout in the browser. This is really cool. It makes it a lot simple. It makes it a lot faster. So this is a quote from a friend of mine from Twitter, and he was really worried about his complex layout he designed, and he thought, right, I'm going to leave it to the end because, like, I don't like CSS that much, and I'm just going to try and tackle it all in one go. And he said, right, I'm going to allocate half a day of my budget towards this. And then he gets down, sits in his CSS file, and writes it out in CSS Grid what he thinks it should be. Oh, but that was it. What he thought it should be was correct. In 5 minutes, he'd layered out a complex layout. And that's really powerful and, like, just makes our life a lot easier. And there's nothing I like more than making my life easier. Cool. Next topic, web animation. So not a lot of you heard of this one. And this is a really interesting API for doing animations in the web. So previously, the best way to do animations was to use CSS animations or CSS transitions. And they're really nice, and they're still a good way to work. But if you want to interact with them via JavaScript, then you end up doing stuff like you use JavaScript to apply a class to your image to trigger the animation or the transition. And then if you want to wait for it to finish, you have to add an event listener for transition end and animation end. You then have to clean up when you're finished. And it's a real pain in the ass. And it means we're basically hacking CSS to make it do what we want it to do. When really what we're trying to do is do animations through JavaScript. So this is where the new Web Animation API comes in. So it looks like this. In this case, ball is a HTML element, which just has an emoji in it. And it has two properties. The keyframes, which is an array of objects which represents CSS, or it's an object with arrays of properties. I'll show you on the next slide. So here's the two ways of animating the ball the same way. So I can either make it go down this array of transforms, or I can have like the properties where the transform itself has an array. So the two ways of doing it, they're both the same. Personally, I like using the second method, but it's whatever you prefer, really. And this just does an animation. This is using the Web Animation API here. So over 1 second, translate Y 80 vertical height units up the document. It's got lots of properties you can define. So for example, I can make it go twice. I can make it go twice back and forth. And I can give it an easing function just to, that one didn't actually do the animation. Lol, I broke that slide. Oh, I broke that one. Okay, sorry about that, but normally it would. See, this is what I get for editing my slide deck literally 10 minutes before I step on the thing. Yeah, so the cool thing about it is that you now no longer have to listen for transition end events or animation end events. it now gives you a promise which you can wait for it to resolve and then do whatever you need. So if I wanted to throw the ball in the air and wait for it to land and then do something, I can listen for the .finished event on the animation object. The .finished promise on the animation object. Who here is using promises in like that code already? Okay, not as many hands as I would have hoped. Promises have been around for like a long time. They're like one of the first things to land in ES6. It's just a really nice way to work. Lots of modern web APIs, which are asynchronous, will often now return a promise rather than waiting on an event or callbacks. But the cool thing with promises is that you can use them with really, really new JavaScript, like asynchronous functions, and you can await for a promise to finish before moving on. So who is using async await in their code? Okay, that's about as many people who use promises. I think there's like... so for those of you who haven't raised your hand up, check out ES6 and Plus. It's really cool. There's really great stuff in JavaScript these days. So async await functions, essentially what this means is that it does an animation, which it then waits for it to finish before it runs the next line of code. You can even use synchronous JavaScript to write asynchronous code. So here I'm looping over each domino. This is code I've copy and pasted from that starter slide where I had all the dominoes falling down. So it goes over each domino, and it waits for it to finish before moving on. And then once that function has finished doing, then I can do something like submit a form or go to my next slide or whatever. Cool, right, web components. Web components are what I'm doing everything in these days. Like the way I'm working, I tend to write some CSS and some JavaScript and some HTML, and then once I've got it how I like it, I stick it in a component so I never have to write it again, which is a pretty neat way to work. You can define your own HTML elements, because after all, we know better what we want in HTML than the people who make web browsers. So here, if I have a my-car element, I can make it do whatever I want. The only restriction is that the name of my element has to have a hyphen in it. So if we're using HTML where your tag name has hyphens, then you're using custom elements. So yeah, there were quite a few of you using custom elements already. I don't remember how many it was. Can you quickly show me again? All right, so a fair few. They're pretty usable. They've landed in Chrome. They're landed in Samsung Internet. They're coming to Firefox really soon. I can't remember off the top of my head the support for the other browsers. Sorry, other browsers. But there is a polyfill that works really well. So you can start using them today, but using the polyfill. And when it lands in the other browsers, you can just stop shipping the polyfill and save a chunk of JavaScript, and nothing else will have to change. So have a go at using them today and start putting them into your code. I was going to introduce that before I clicked it. So yeah, the real power of web components comes from the shadow DOM. So the shadow DOM is like the hidden side to HTML. You can put, whatever you put in the shadow DOM is hidden from the rest of the document tree. So you don't have to worry about interfering it with other JavaScript. You can write some really messy HTML with 1,000 div tags, and no one needs to know your dirty little secret. So it hides your div soup. Like your messy HTML is just tucked away and it's all hidden. But not only that, you can write messy CSS and it gets hidden away because it can't affect the rest of the document. So these super general selectors where I'm making all divs have the font family Papyrus and all spans have font family Comic Sans, like this dirty CSS is only affecting my custom element. Like it can't escape the custom element. And the nice thing also is that CSS selectors from the document itself can't affect stuff that's in your web component. So you can build something and as a web component and ship it and be pretty sure your clients aren't going to be able to accidentally break it, which I think is pretty handy. You get callbacks into the life cycle of the element. So you can react to the user adding it to the document or removing it from the document or to its attributes changing. This allows you to write an element that can be used dynamically, can be used with any framework, and all it cares about is where it is in the document. Like, has it been added? Has it been removed? And if you start and have the attributes been changed. So if you handle that stuff correctly, you can use it with any framework, and you just treat it exactly like normal HTML tags, and that's pretty neat. And you end up building these building blocks of code and style and documents, which you can then ship as just basically Lego and have people join it together without being experts in your framework or without being experts in your code. I mean, like, in order to use web components, all you need to know is HTML. So if you wanted to build something that was accessible to even the newest developer, for example, if you're working for a company that allows people to modify, I've had the mouse in the middle of that slide for the whole thing. There we go. Yeah, so if you're working for a company that's letting clients write their own code, but who might not necessarily be experts, you can have them use web components, and they can probably still wrangle it with HTML, because HTML is really friendly. One of my favorite web component libraries is a library built by Mozilla called A-Frame. And A-Frame, components in A-Frame wrap 3.js. So you write HTML and you get WebGL. Like, I've got children who have never done any programming before to build complex WebGL scenes just because they only need to learn HTML to do it. And I think that's really beautiful. And if you're afraid of using like web components today, so like, oh yeah, we have a complex framework suite which we picked 5 years ago and now we're totally anchored to, or like you've got like if your senior developer really likes a particular framework and you're like, oh, I have to work within it, or if you really like a particular framework, it doesn't matter. Like, web components are just HTML elements. So if you build web components, you can just include the tag for your web component in your markup, in your whatever framework you're using, and it will still work, whether it's client-side or server-side, whether it's WordPress or React. It will still work. It's just HTML. And that's like so powerful. So if you want to like start patching bits of your framework and you've got bits of functionality which are really like a really good candidate for being like modularized into a component, this is a good way to do that, and a great place to start using web components. Cool, so this is the last thing I'm going to introduce before I actually talk about what I really want to talk about today. How much time do I have? Ah, cool, good for time. So CSS Custom Properties. So there weren't many of you using this, and you really can, like they work in pretty much all major web browsers these days, and they're incredibly powerful. So this is what it looks like at its front and foremost. So here in the root of my document, I've assigned a new variable, color cyan, to a kind of cyany color. Well, it's the color in the top left of my slide decks. I'm really lazy for my examples. I just copy and paste code out of my slide deck software. So yeah, you could define that variable anywhere in your document, and anywhere further down the cascade can then use that using var. So in this case, background var color cyan. So that's pretty neat. But we've had variables in preprocessors for ages. So what's the big deal? Well, you can use it in calc, which is really nice. You can't do that in a preprocessor because it doesn't know what the units are. So I could do 5 pixels times 5, or 5 pixels plus 6 EM. You can use it in calc, which is really nice and really powerful, and allows us to do some really dynamic CSS. What else is really powerful is that it's based upon the CSS's cascade. So if you have if you set a variable, so if you set a custom property in the root of your document to 5 pixels, and in the main of your document you set it to 3 pixels, any p tag outside of the main tag will have 5 times 5, 25, will have 25 pixels margin. Anything in the main tag will have 15 pixels margin. Sorry, I'm really slow at maths, which is why I use computers to do it for me. So yeah, so that's really nice. You can take advantage of the cascade, and you can have stuff where you don't have to worry about variables overwriting stuff, because you can set what they are in the outermost element where you need it and change it accordingly. So that's really cool. This is my favorite pattern it enables, though. So here I've defined my 2 variables, which I'm then using in the main at the bottom. But often when I'm writing media queries, I often have a whole bunch of hacks to make it work on mobile, or a whole bunch of hacks to make it work on desktop, depending which way I'm going. But now I don't just change some random properties and have no idea why I'm changing them. Then they're labeled, so I know that on large screens bigger than 800 pixels, the padding is going to be increased to 15 pixels. Sorry, to bigger than 500 pixels, the padding will be 15 pixels, and on bigger than 800 pixels, it will be 30 pixels. So I've now got responsive design, but I can clearly see in each media query exactly what I'm changing because it's named in the property itself. There's no having to be like, I have a margin changed here. Why did I change that? Or even worse, why did that employee who left the company 2 years ago set that? It's so clear and makes a lot more sense. Here's pretty cool. So there's something new that's hasn't landed yet. So this is only because I'm using a recent version of Chrome with the experimental features turned on. So there is the Houdini Paint API. This, has anyone tried or played with this at all yet? All right, 3 people. Yeah, this stuff is really awesome. So essentially, it allows you to write a worklet which gets called by CSS, and it allows you to draw the background of elements using canvas, using the same kind of functionality you have on a 2D canvas. And if you've used 3D or 3JS before, you might remember that it used to have a canvas renderer. So here I've imported the canvas renderer into my worklet, and I'm rendering 3D graphics inside CSS. Here's the code for this. So background image is Paint 3, which is 3 is the name of my worklet, and Paint is part of the Houdini Paint API, telling it to use it. I'm using custom properties to control the rotation of the text it's drawing. So, so I've rotated it 10 in the x-axis, 20 degrees in the y-axis, and I'm using other CSS variables for the padding of the element. So this is really nice. Like I can have something kind of complex, and I can use it and I can control it entirely from my CSS with no JavaScript running on the main thread, which is super nice and really cool, and it's just making CSS incredibly powerful. So now I'm going to start talking about how we can use these together, because all these things I've just introduced are incredibly powerful on their own. But this is the web. We don't use APIs just on their own. We always have to interact with other things. And you get some really beautiful patterns emerge. So here we're going to start using web components with custom properties. So I mentioned earlier that CSS in your document doesn't affect the internals of your web components. Well, I lied, sorry. Custom properties are able to change stuff you do in your shadow DOM. So here I've defined a variable in my root of the document, which I'm reading in the style sheet of my custom element, which is really nice, because it means that I can ship a bunch of web components, and I can ship a CSS file which can theme them all differently. So I can ship the same components to 15 different clients and give them 15 different CSS files, and they all have a totally different look and feel, which is defined in the component themselves. So like the complex bit I ship once, and the bit I'd like to style, I can ship as many times as I want. So they all get like a unique themed feeling, and I only have to do a 15th of the work. So like everything I do is motivated by laziness. I'm not the most hardworking person ever. So, but yeah, you might be worried like, okay, so if web components can pierce the shadow DOM, then that means anyone can write, sorry, if custom properties can pierce the shadow DOM, that means anyone can write custom properties. And that's when we, to control my element. And that's true, and that's where we take the power of it being based upon the cascade. Because if I set a variable in my custom element itself, then the custom element will read that instead and use that. But that doesn't stop us from overwriting it at a later point. So here, I've overwritten my var in the style tag to become 20 pixels, so I can still control it. Or if I don't like writing style directly into the HTML, because that's pretty nasty, and we don't really like doing that, you can also control it from the style sheet. So this is the same effect as before. So this is really powerful because it gives us the same effect as in my first example of when we're theming elements from our style sheet. But now it stops people from accidentally controlling it. So everything's much more intentional. Right. Next, CSS Grid and web components. So my favorite two properties about these is that they both allow us to clean up our HTML. So we have our original very dirty HTML, and we start using CSS Grid. That allows us to get rid of the HTML elements we were using just to lay out the page. We start using custom properties, and that hides all of the elements we were just using to make our widgets look good. So now we have HTML, which is really neat, has all the non-declarative stuff either removed or hidden inside web components. And although like neatness is really nice and it's good, it's not like a major motivational factor. But what is really cool is that the HTML is now entirely semantic. All of the data we need to render the page is in the HTML file So we don't need to start doing stuff like shipping down JSON and generating a gross HTML file. We just ship a good-looking HTML file from the start. It dramatically decreases the complexity of our build processes, which is so nice. Like, it takes, like, we've taken all the really complex parts of our HTML file and we've made them really clear. Like, you can read through a file that's, through a HTML file that's written with grid and custom properties, grid and custom elements, and it becomes immediately clear what the developer intended to happen. And if it's clear what the developer means, then it's easier to debug when it doesn't work the way you expect, which is really nice. Right, CSS Grid Custom Properties. So they're both CSS API, so there's obviously lots we can do here. So for a simpler example, we're just saying the number of columns in our grid template is just defined by this custom property grid columns. Then on small screens, grid columns goes from 5 columns to 1 column, so everything is in a line. That's just a simple way to do a nice responsive design. But you can do stuff that really isn't simple. So here I've defined, oh, that's too small. I'm going to zoom out a bit. Cool, hopefully that's still a bit readable. Whoa, has one of those screens disappeared? Oh. Oh yeah, oh, well, I'll just carry on. Everyone look that way. So here I've defined 2 layouts, layout big and layout small. They're both pretty complicated layouts. There's a lot going on there. I've laid them out using like the most condensed form factor, so I'm not going to explain to you like how each layout works specifically, but one is optimized for desktops, one is optimized for mobile. So in my grid, I'm setting grid template is layout small by default, and then on big, it's grid template layout big. That way I don't have to copy and paste these humongous style declarations from all out my documents. I can have my layouts even defined in a separate CSS file and have that file warning, don't touch, really clever person wrote this, and use them when I need to without having to worry about maintaining them throughout my whole code base whenever they're duplicated in media queries or in other documents which might use them, which is just a really nice way to work. Cool, custom properties and web animations. So you might be thinking, like, how can we get these two to interact? Custom properties is an API for CSS files. Web animations is a JavaScript API. Well, there's a few ways we can do it. So here is one way I can work. So here is how I define all of the easings in my slide deck. They're all defined in the CSS file because easings are a style property. They're not something which, like, they're not a dynamic JavaScript thing. So I've defined them in my CSS file so I can use them for transitions, use them for animations, but I also want to use them in the web animation API. Well, fortunately, you can use getComputedStyle to read what your custom properties are set to. So here, I've pulled out the easing function from my CSS file so I can use it in the web animation API. Here's a good example for accessibility. So by default, I've defined a duration factor to be 1. For elements which are for slow animations, I've set duration factor to 2. And if they're using a browser which has the prefers reduced motion media query, then I set the duration factor to 0, which means that it'll happen really quickly. I can then read this, this property from my JavaScript, and I can set the duration of my animations to be like 500 times like the number, like that duration factor, custom property converted to a number, giving me the ability to write CSS that has style effects on the elements themselves, which is really like really powerful and really nice. But wouldn't it be even nicer if we could use the animation API on custom properties directly? Because all the examples I've had so far is animating normal CSS properties. And the good news is you almost can. So you can do it if you turn on enable experimental web platform features in Chrome. It's like hopefully coming really soon. I really, really like it because you can do stuff like you register a property, so the browser knows how it can animate it. So it knows X coordinate is a length, so it goes from like 0 to 10 pixels, or you can do something like this. So you remember that example from earlier where I was using Houdini, and the rotations were controlled using custom properties? Well, I can animate the custom properties using web animations. So I've registered the rotate Y property as a number, and then I'm animating rotate Y from -180 degrees to 180 degrees, and just tell it to animate that every 6 seconds. And then I end up with a really cool animation that can affect lots of things really nicely. So this is like a really cool effect. Of course, this particular example is a terrible idea. Don't do it. Because this is a really expensive rendering animation, so I'm effectively causing a repaint every single frame. So if you tried scrolling this document, it would be a bit janky. But this is just one example of like some of the stuff you can do by animating custom properties. But yeah, I think I'm out of time now. So thank you so much for listening. You've been amazing, and I hope you try out all of this stuff and have like a really good time playing with all our new toys in the web. Thank you.